Hello, class. Welcome back to our flipped classroom. We spent the last 2 weeks talking about the basics of geography. Now we are going to apply the knowledge we gained and explore how geography affected 3 early settlements. Let's take a minute to preview our essential question. How did geography affect the early settlement of Egypt, Kush, and Canaan? By the end of this video and our time together over the next 3 days, you will be able to answer this question. But before we get started, let's make sure you remember to do a few following things. Recall and apply your understanding of the 5 themes of geography as we go through this video. It will help you understand the early settlements. Make sure you're taking detailed notes, but keep it simple. We are going to discuss a lot of information, so make sure you are using abbreviations and paraphrasing to make things easier. Also, make sure you're considering any feedback I provided to you about your note-taking strategies. If you need to pause the video and review the rubric from your last set of video notes, please do so now. Okay, so we've talked about the essential question. Did you record it? If not, make sure you write it down. Finally, make sure you record any questions you have as you go through the video. Record both questions to help confirm information you've learned, as well as questions you still have that would be helpful for us to discuss tomorrow. Okay, before we get started, I want to make sure you take note of the layout of the slides. At the top of each slide, you are going to see a number and title. This corresponds to the chapter and section in your textbook. At the bottom of each slide, you are going to see a topic or a question. This tells you what the slide is talking about. Both of these indicators are good titles and subtitles for your notes. Okay, so now that you know how to take notes, let's start by answering a few questions. Why do you think people settle in areas? What impacts their decision? Environmental factors greatly impact where people settle. Environmental factors are the elements in your environmental surroundings. 3 important environmental factors that impact the decision of the early settlements are water, topography, and vegetation. Topography is the shape and elevation of the surface features of the land. You should be very familiar with topographical features after constructing your edible maps. Vegetation is the plant life in an area or region. And water, well, seems pretty simple. It refers to the naturally occurring or man-made sources of water in an area. These 3 factors are determined by an area's physical geography. Physical geography includes mountains, rivers, deserts, climate, and the fertility of the soil. But why are these environmental factors so important to the discussion of early settlements? In this chapter, we are going to discuss how geography, specifically the 3 environmental factors, affected 3 civilizations that arose in northern Africa and southwestern Asia. These civilizations were the Egypt, Kush, and Israelite peoples. The Egyptians settled along the northern part of the Nile River, in the northeast corner of Africa. Their civilization lasted from about 3100 BCE to 350 CE. The Kushites settled along the southern part of the Nile River, to the south of Egypt and Africa. Their civilization began around 2000 BCE and lasted until 350 CE. The Israelites, later called the Jews, settled along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in an area called Canaan, which was to the northeast of Egypt on the Arabian Peninsula in Asia. The Israelite civilization began about 1800 BCE. Although the Jews were forced from their homeland in 70 CE, their civilization continues to flourish today. Now that you have an idea of when and where these 3 civilizations settled, let's check it out on a map. First, let's find the Nile River, since this was such an important feature to the Egyptians and Kushites. So the Nile River starts around here and flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. Along the Nile River, you will see the Egyptian and Kushite settlements. Now, if we take a look at the northeast of Egypt to the Arabian Peninsula, you will find the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Here you will find between the coast and the Jordan River the area of Canaan. This is where the Israelites settled. Now that we've seen where the ancient civilizations are on the map, let's discuss the 3 environmental factors that impacted decisions of the early civilizations. Water was the most important environmental factor, and it was important for many reasons. Drinking is needed for basic survival. Water is also needed for sanitation. With water, people can bathe and wash, which helps prevent diseases. Water provided a food source for people. They could fish and hunt birds and animals that gathered near water. Farmers needed water to grow their crops. Like we learned when studying Mesopotamia, irrigation helped farmers maintain a steady food supply. Finally, water could be used as a means of transportation. People could travel by boat and trade with other civilizations in further distances. Topography, or the shape of the land, is also an important factor to the early settlements. Farmers usually settled in large, flat, open areas, such as coastal plains and valleys, because these areas provided rich soil and room for farming. While mountains and deserts are not good areas for farming because they had little water, poor temperatures, and conditions that were often too difficult to survive in, they did provide protection from other civilizations, as they were hard to cross. Our third environmental factor is vegetation, or plant life. Trees, bushes, flowers, grass, reeds, and other crops were very important to early settlers. Many aspects of physical geography can affect vegetation. For example, climate, such as mild weather, regular rain, or fresh rain, can impact the amount and type of vegetation that an area has. Vegetation has an influence on people. People used plants as a source of food. The early settlers also used vegetation to make products or materials, such as baskets, tools, medicine, rope, and paper. Finally, vegetation provides shade from the sun, and also plants and flowers help to make a place beautiful. So now that we've talked about the environmental factors, let's look at how they impacted the 3 early settlements of Egypt, Kush, and Canaan. First, let's look at Egypt and Kush. Both the Egyptians and the Kushites settled near the Nile River. The Egyptians lived along the northern part of the river, while the Kushites lived to the south. Flowing north from deep in Africa, the Nile River created a long, fertile valley that ended in a marshy delta at the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River was the most important physical feature to the early settlements. Time out for a bonus. Time out. Research and record why the Nile flows north instead of south, like most other rivers in the world. Record at least 2 rivers that flow to the north other than the Nile. Hint: this information can be found on worldatlas.com. Okay, time back in. Okay, back to our topic, the physical features of the Nile River settlements. The Nile River Valley was surrounded by the Libyan Desert and the Nubian Desert, which, as we just mentioned, provided protection from invaders by being a natural barrier. However, the lack of water in the deserts made them useless for farming. Fortunately, Egypt was surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north. This provided a link to other civilizations for trade as well as fishing for food. In addition, the Red Sea bordered Egypt and Kush to the east, providing a water source as well as food source. In the Nile River Valley, the river provided many things to the settlers of Egypt and Kush. It provided natural irrigation and fertilization. Every summer, the river overflowed its banks and floodwater soaked the dry grounds. After several weeks, the waters went down and a thin layer of silt, which is rich soil, was left behind. This made the soil of the river valley perfect for animal life, vegetation, and farming. Also, the wide open, flat topography of the river valley was ideal for daily life activities and farming. In addition, while vegetation was rare in the desert areas, the deserts did provide useful plants such as papyrus. Now let's talk about the physical features of Canaan. Canaan was a diverse land northeast of Egypt, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the area that was settled by the Israelites. Canaan's physical features included plains and valleys along its coast to the west, hills and mountains such as the Lebanon Mountains to the north, and the hills of Galilee. To the south, to the east you had desert, such as the Syrian desert, and to the southwest, the Negev desert. While the deserts did not provide the best climate, rains did soak the Negev desert during the winter, which supplied the area with water. The Mediterranean Sea provided a wet, fertile plains that could be farmed. Water was a key environmental factor for Canaan. In very ancient times, the Mediterranean Sea enabled traders from many lands to visit Canaan. The main source of fresh water for the Canaanites was the Jordan River. However, unlike the Nile River, the Jordan River did not flood regularly, so its valleys were not as fertile as the Nile's. The Jordan River flowed south through the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee, which was a freshwater lake, was abundant with fish and wildlife. Meanwhile, the Dead Sea, which was so salty nothing could grow or live in it, not even plants. Hence the name Dead Sea. So as you can see, the Jordan River was the main source of fresh water for the early Canaanites. In many of the areas of Canaan, the hilly land and dry soil made it difficult for growing crops. So many Canaanites became herders in the mountains rather than farmers. These herders became nomads, moving from place to place to find areas for their animals to graze. In general, Canaan's hot, dry climate discouraged abundant plant life. Vegetation was most plentiful around the Jordan River. Some areas, such as small forests and scrubby plant vegetation, did exist. However, grasslands were common, and the herders made good use of them to feed their animals. Okay, so now that we've talked about the 3 environmental factors that impact settlement, as well as the 3 early settlements of Egypt, Kush, and Canaan, let's try to summarize what we've learned. Here's my first attempt at summarizing all the information. 3 environmental factors that affected early settlement were water, topography, and vegetation. Egypt and Kush were settlements located on the plains of the Nile River. Although surrounded mostly by desert, the Nile River Valley provided the Egyptians and Kushites fresh water, fertile land for farming, and useful vegetation. Canaan was an area along the Mediterranean coast, northeast of Egypt, which was settled by the ancient Israelites. In Canaan, the Jordan River and Sea of Galilee were important sources for fresh water. However, much of the area was too hot and dry or hilly for farming, so many of the Israelites were nomads that herded animals rather than farmers. Whew, that was a mouthful of a summary. Now take a minute to try to create your own summary that makes sense to you. Okay, thank you again for doing your homework. See you tomorrow in class.